even if you don't attend, because then they could see what students came up with. So
exactly.
All right, so we are recording now. Welcome back, everybody. I'm going to give it about 2 more seconds here to make sure we're all back. Yeah, I think we're all back. So real quick, what I'm seeing, I haven't been able to go through them in detail, but despite all of our technical difficulties and confusing you all probably with those, I'm looking at this and the responses are much more thorough than they have been in the last few weeks. So this is promising. So we've got some good stuff here. So who's presenting for question 1? If please go ahead and open up your mic, and you can just go ahead and read through the actual response for the concepts there. Hi.
Transportation affects cities because it gave us informed time zones. Time zones were created in November 1883 due to the struggles of not knowing when goods and materials would arrive on time. Rapid growth of industry and industrialists and just so sorry.
It's okay.
And industrialized cities unite together urban and rural produce into the national markets. Ranches drove millions of condos. Did I say that correctly?
Cattle with cattle. Yeah, but yeah, I got you.
Chicago produced nearly 500 million pounds of beef annually. Crossroads connected American agriculture goods capital markets in New York's London and consumed from all corners of the U.S. Transportations made it difficult for goods to be transported from manufacturing factories that many industries gave wealthy to shorteners.
Excellent. Thank you for presenting. One thing before we get into the nitty gritty here, I bold this right here because this is kind of the main concept that's going to catalyze the rest of the details here. Is basically the overall effect of mass transportation, i.e. the railroads. It's creating a national market that did not exist prior to the railroads being there. And that's going to have all sorts of effect on the economy, on the society, on how people kind of perceive what it means to be, you know, a person living within a society. All right. Is there anything you wanted to add here, Mr. Pietrzak?
No, I'm just trying to add little comments as you speak into the slide notes.
Okay. Let me just go through some of the facts that are listed here. Transcontinental Railroad built between 1863 to 69. Okay, excellent. So this is good information, and so this is something you'd want to include there. You know, how it developed. You know, these railroads and to the extent of which it developed. Millions of acres and mass transported people goods led to the creation of time zones. Excellent, right? And you know, this is an interesting thing. This is a process too. Kind of an aside, but one of the things with chapter 16 and 18, a lot of what we're studying here in these chapters is the beginning of what we perceive as normal in the modern era. This is the beginning of it, right? And so people being tied to the clock is the beginning of this process here, which wasn't always the case, right? People used to not really think in terms of, oh, I've got to be somewhere exactly at 8 a.m. because that's when, you know, my job starts, right? People more or less got to places when they got there, and we're more tied to the patterns of the sun. You know, you got up and started working at sun up, and then you quit at sundown. That's all going to change with this right here. Did we lose Isaac? Did we lose Mr. Peterzak? Looks like we lost Mr. Peterzak. Oh, what? He'll probably come back in just a second here. All right, let's move on to question number 2. So can somebody present for question number 2? What factors led to urban immigration from the countryside?
So, many people began to immigrate to the United States to build a better life. And between 1870 and 1920, more than 25 million immigrants had come to the U.S. A lot of these factors were known as the push and pull factors. The pull factors were being able to afford land and having employment rather than their home country where they really didn't have anything, anywhere to work or any land to buy because it was too expensive. Oh, wait. Okay. And there was also something that talked about finding sanctuary, which many people do today. And also industrial capitalism was the biggest factor that brought immigrants to the U.S. Many of them worked in producing goods such as steel, textiles, food products. And this rush of people also allowed for cities to grow, and a lot of people were coming from the countryside to the city, which also brought these big cities to be what they are, like New York, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Milwaukee, and St. Louis.
Excellent. One thing I want to point out, and this question could probably be worded better, and I'll think about how to word it better. But this response here is a great response, but mostly it's going to be a response for this question here: why did immigrants leave their countries to come to America? What this question is asking is basically the people who are already living here, Americans already living here, are leaving basically the countryside or rural areas, farms, and all of that, and going to urban areas, cities, right? And so basically what we're trying to see here is, well, what made people leave the rural areas, the farms, the countryside, and move into urban areas or cities, right? And to cut to the chase of why people are moving from rural countryside areas to urban city areas is because of what we were discussing in the previous slide. And it's this right here, this new national market that has been created, right? And so basically what prior to the second industrial revolution, if you were a small farmer in Georgia or Tennessee or wherever, right, your market would have been very limited as far as the people you would be selling your product to. So let's say you were a tobacco farmer. And so the people that you went to church with, that you lived around, would be your main buyers, right? Well, actually, let's give you a different example. Let's say you're an artisan, right? This is a lot of what affected migration from the countryside to urban areas. Let's say you were an artisan, which meant like you were specialized in making desks, like custom desks for people in your community, right? And so you would make, you wouldn't get rich off of that, but you would make, a decent living, something that you could probably reasonably suspect that could get you through the rest of your life, right? And that skill you would have learned from your grandfather, your father, an uncle, or something like that. And so it would have been something when you were younger, you would realize, well, this is what I'm going to do for a living. And you would have been considered a valued person within your community for that specialized trait that you, professional trait that you had developed for yourself. With the advent of the Industrial Revolution, with railroads connecting cities together and markets together, and with the advent of factories developed, that desk that people are going to purchase can be mass produced. And so that artisan who has a specialized trait his market is going to be greatly reduced to only very wealthy people who could afford to have a handcrafted desk made for themselves or whatever product it might be. And so it's going to be a situation where many artisans are not able to make a living anymore. And so they're leaving in many ways for the same reasons why people are leaving their original countries, like from Europe, and going to American cities. People in American countrysides are also leaving and going to the cities to hopefully get employed in a factory job where they're not specialized. They're just pulling a lever, from 12 to 16 hours a day and doing a menial task and not getting paid to the degree that they were getting paid. So anything you wanted to add to that, Mr. Pietrzak?
No, again, I just said pull factors attracting people to work in factories. I have it in the notes. Urbanizing due to the industrialization that's going on, increased mechanization on farms that leads to less need for labor on farms, and the growth of corporations that are beating out small farmers, causing them to either foreclose, lose their farms, or just leave to go look for work in the cities.
Yeah.
So I'm putting that in the notes underneath the slide.
Yeah, and so I brought up the example of the artisan, but yeah, this also applies to the small farmer who would be able to make a living with his localized market that was prior to the Industrial Revolution, but that market is going to be greatly expanded. And right from the beginning, it's virtually impossible for a small farmer to compete when you have these economic scales of where somebody has these large farms and is able to move their product at a much cheaper rate than someone with a small farm who is not able to. Aside also from the corruption that's going on with the railroads too. You have people like Rockefeller who are demanding his competitors get more expensive rates, and that's happening kind of across the board and squeezing out the smaller farmer or the smaller artisan when it comes to these things. But yeah, thank you very much. And yeah, won't happen this semester, but this is something that looking at this, I can see why somebody might get confused when they look at this at first glance. But really see what it's at when you see a question. Try to see what it is asking there. So urban immigration from the countryside. So let's see what we get for question number 3. So,
but there's going to be a lot of carryover from this part to question 3 too.
Yeah, a lot of the same thing is going to apply. You just want to, if you do get this question on the exam, you just really want to make it understood that you're referring to people already living in the United States, not people immigrating to the United States. All right, who's presenting for question number 3? All right, question number 3, group 3. Are you guys out there?
Let's see, I have Angelica and 3, 4 anonymous cheetahs and blobfish, grizzly cheetahs.
All right. Well, for the sake of time, unless somebody jumps in.
I'm here.
Okay, excellent.
For question 3?
Yes, excellent.
I'm sorry, I just had so many windows open and I couldn't open.
Okay, yeah, I know how that feels.
Okay, so why did immigrants leave their countries? Is that one it?
Yep.
Okay, so I thought somebody was just reading off of that right now.
No, I was just asking anyone from group 3 to present.
Oh, okay. Okay, so look, I want to double check maybe if I'm wrong, but does the Homestead Act have anything to do with it? Where they were offering free land and people from the city wanting to travel to the west.
That's going to be a factor, not a major factor,
Okay.
but it is a factor. There were definitely immigrants that did take advantage of the Homestead Act, but a lot of these immigrants that are coming in are finding themselves in a lot of factory work, though.
Okay. I mean, the only reason I'm saying is because I'm watching this show, the 1883, and it shows about the whole Western expansion and everything. So, so reasons for why immigrants left their homeland varied because it actually, historians called a push and pull factor. Russian Jewish family that is being persecuted in European pogroms.
Pogroms, yeah.
pogroms might look to the
Pogroms?
United States as a sanctuary. So foundations such as Italian Workmen's Club, Eastern European Jewish mutual aid societies, Polish Catholic churches, published newspapers in dozens of languages, and bought spaces to keep their tradition alive, increased more immigration. And at that, from what I remember reading, was they were writing to family in the out in their where their country is at, and just trying to persuade them to come over because there's lots of land, there's work. Labored in large industrial complexes, producing goods, steel, textiles, food products. Some people from different countries migrated to the U.S. for opportunities for buying cheaper land to start a new life. Many of them moved from their homeland to afford land of their own, because in their own country, they couldn't afford the land. They found the land cheaper over here. Now, new industrial modes of production, and most came to look for work and cheaper land for those who could not afford in their own homeland. Oh, I just repeated myself. Chicago meat process industry, it created a big industrial, I guess, like a lot of jobs, and chain migration, 1890, immigrants and their families, 60% of population in the northern cities. Industrial capitalism was a #1 factor in immigration from 1880 to 1920, and then better opportunities and cheaper land again. 1870 through 1920, over 25 million immigrants arrived in the U.S.
Excellent. Yeah, this is a very thorough response here. Something that we were referring to earlier that you mentioned here, this is, an example of an extreme form of trauma that a lot of European immigrants would have experienced. So Jewish families, not just in Russia, but throughout Europe, often experienced these pogroms. And basically what these were raids on communities to expel any Jews living there. And they typically, like the lynchings that we just looked at, coincided with downturns in the economy. So the economy had crashed, and scapegoats were needed. In these circumstances, pogroms were, basically the targets were Jewish families who were treated in really horrific ways. And it's the most horrific thing you could possibly think of. It's just dragging people out of their homes and butchering them, raping women, and just really just trying to create a situation where these people are communicated that you are not welcome here anymore. And so, yeah, this is definitely one of the more extreme push factors that are bringing a lot of people to the Americas. This chain migration is basically dealing. You mentioned the chain migration. That's basically dealing with European families kind of networking with each other, right? So those Europeans that first come here are letting them know that, hey, there are jobs available here, come on over. And it expedited exponentially immigration from Europe to the United States. Yeah. So anything, Mr. Pietrzak, you wanted to add here? This is a pretty good, thorough response.
And the terminology, I know it's not in the text, but it does mention that in chain migration, you could also refer to American letters. So usually it's just a communication from those that had preceded them coming to the United States, talking about, hey, we get to eat meat every day in our meals. So something that would attract them, and they come and they come to the United States. And I added this extra part because it is in the text as well. It talks about how an Italian would come work in a steel factory and then go back home after they made enough money. Well, the term for that is birds of passage. So if you want to put that in quotes, that would be a good additional fact you could add, that many immigrants did come as birds of passage to make enough money and return to their country of origin.
Oh, excellent. All right, let's move on to number 4. So someone from group 4, can you open up your mic and present describing the relationship between inner cities and poverty? What type of housing problems did cities face? Did reform efforts help?
Okay. Okay, so poor immigrants moved to American cities to gain new opportunities. African Americans given low paying jobs in order to reserve well paying ones for whites. Cities were hubs of industry and a house for many factory workers, which are mainly African Americans and immigrants. As the population grew rapidly, African Americans and immigrants were found trapped in crowded, crime-ridden slums. Tammany Hall helped provide essential infrastructure to New York, but it was not enough to significantly help immigrants and African Americans thrive in cities.
Excellent. City booms, New York. Yeah. And just to kind of give a little bit more context to what Tammany Hall was, this is the political machine that came out of New York, run by Boss Tweed for many of the years there. And what a political machine is, it's a a organization run by a political party, mainly the Democratic Party at this time. And it was they were inherently corrupt and abusive in power, despite their best efforts to reform the problems in the city. Right. One of the things we want to keep in mind with the rise of with the Second Industrial Revolution and their effect on cities is that they changed these cities in ways that nobody, no matter what the intentions, if they were the best intentions, could anticipate and or plan for. So a lot of these problems that we're seeing are just kind of runaway results of huge influx of population, of capital, of money, of power, and just of a changing environment. And Tammany Hall was, despite the problems that they would have, they were attempting to address the abject poverty that was developing, the disease that was occurring within these cities, and the lack of infrastructure. And what we mean for lack of infrastructure are things that mainly we take for granted today, right? So, where in a tenement apartment where you're having, sometimes up to 5 to 6 families sharing the same apartment, where do you suspect these people are going to the bathroom, right? They don't have toilets. They're dumping their waste right outside the window. And some of these tenement apartments are several stories high. And so they're trying to address these issues as they're developing, to some effect, but often it's not quick enough for the people living under these conditions.
Professor Kennedy, an interesting thing, I was looking for tenement, like you spoke about tenement housing, dumbbell tenements, slums. Tenement housing isn't a word that's in chapter 18. So
Okay.
that might be something that we'd want to have them look into or include. It was the crowded living conditions, the slums, these unhygienic squalor in which a lot of immigrants are forced to live in. But they're called tenement housing. So
Yeah.
I put it on the bottom.
Oops. Sorry.
17.
Don't want to watch that again. Is Jacob Reese, was that in 16? Jacob. Yeah, Jacob Reese. This was the focus of a lot of this guy's work here, Jacob Reese. Oops, where'd it go? And he's covered also in chapter 16 as well. But let's see if we have any images in this primary source here.
There's some images of his in the PowerPoint for chapter 18. The
Okay.
street Arabs or street merchants, I can't remember the title of it. And there's the primary document is for chapter 18, and it's an excerpt from How the Other Half Lives.
Yeah, and what this guy did, basically, I mean, this is really amazing work that this guy did, but given the fact that photography is a relatively new phenomenon, he went in to these tenement apartments and to the slums of New York, basically, and took pictures of the way people were living at this time. Let me see if I can locate that there's pictures of it in the PowerPoint slide here.
And a lot of them were staged. where he'd get the kids and say, look, you're barefoot, it's cold, let me put you in this area so it's a more dramatic picture. But it's he didn't have to dress them or he just staged them, which is a little bit different.
Yeah, and the overall effect is it did work. People did begin to realize that there were serious problems in cities that had developed and were creating conditions that were unlivable for people. And it's this is his work is in the the late 1880s, 1890s, and it's going to be influential in the progressive era. It's basically the next chapter that we'll be looking at in the next unit. Okay, that was question, yeah. So moving on to question 5, discuss the emergence of the Jim Crow laws in the American South. So somebody from that group, can you help me out and present here? Somebody from group 5 out there?
Reconstruction, I don't know how to say the word.
Regimes.
Thank you. Tried to grant African American citizenship rights, ended up angering Southern whites. White Southerners implemented the Jim Crow, taking control of state and local government and used their reclaimed power to disenfranchise African Americans. These laws were the segregation of African Americans in schools, transportation, public and private facilities. The Jim Crow laws were made to suppress the Black communities in the South. They were enforced in 1965. Political corruption and groups such as the KKK attempted to stop African Americans from using the power of the 15th Amendment in voting with violent intimidation as well. Lynching was one way Black people got punished for crimes they were accused of. When it happened, people treated it as if it was a carnival. A lot of people attended that, and I can't see the bottom part. White mobs murdered over 5,000 African Americans between between the 1880s and 1950s. Boosters such as Henry Grady said that the South was done with racial questions but lynching and segregation and the industrialization of Jim Crow exposed the South's lingering racial obsessions.
Excellent. Very thorough right here. I added here Reconstruction regimes. What that's basically referring to is congressional Reconstruction. So a lot of what we're seeing with the emergence of Jim Crow laws, and just to make sure everybody understands what Jim Crow means, that we're not talking about an actual person named Jim Crow. We're talking about a set of laws referred to as segregation laws. The origins of that word, it's kind of, I don't want to get into it too much. It's a long story that, but basically it comes from minstrel shows that became incredibly popular. At first, they were done by white performers who performed in blackface beginning in the 1820s. And one of the main characters of the show was Jim Crow. And so post 1820s, Jim Crow became synonymous with being Black. So it was another term for being Black. So Jim Crow is just basically a way of segregating the races, saying that. So what we mean by Reconstruction regimes is basically once Reconstruction is over, 1877, and home rule is returned to the South, meaning that white Southern Democrats were now in charge of their local and state politics. With the removal of federal troops, we're beginning to see a serious pushback against congressional Reconstruction, as we saw with the Civil Rights Act and the 14th and 15th Amendments. One thing I would encourage you here, this is a pretty thorough response here, so there's nothing definitely wrong here. Everything's pretty much covered. But you might want to include, let me bring up, oops, what's her name? I just find her pretty fascinating. Yeah, this person right here, Rebecca Felton, right? And so she is, oops. She is the first female U.S. senator. Her husband died. He was a senator, and so she replaces his position. She was an ardent women's rights activist as well, but unfortunately, her activism for women did not extend to other people that were marginalized in society at this time, mainly African Americans. So she was also an ardent white supremacist, and so. As it's quoted right here, she said, "If it takes lynchings to protect women's dearest possessions from drunken, ravaging beasts, then I say lynch 1,000 a week," right? And so it's a pretty ugly statement from a pretty ugly person who's, mainly a product of her time doing that. But why this is relevant to this question here is, these are laws that are being passed, and that sentiment from powerful people like Rebecca Felton is only reinforcing the emergence of these laws. And so when you have people like that sanctioning the murder and the torturing of 1,000 people a week, as she's proposing there, that's a clear message to anyone who's not white living in America, that these laws are not to be ignored, right? You better fall in line when you see, white-only drinking fountains or, designated spots within railroad cars or whatnot during this time. And the other person I would suggest to bring up here is Ida B. Wells, right? And so this is a kind of a voice of somebody who's trying to push back against this sentiment. And so she was a journalist that exposed a lot of the horrors of lynchings, the Southern horrors of lynchings. It's a groundbreaking work that documented South's lynching culture and exposed the myth of the Black rapist, right? And her work, and she was in Tennessee at that time, and her work there grabbed the ire of white people in there. They burnt down her publication building, and she ended up having to leave and move to New York City, where she remained for the rest of her life, never to return to Tennessee. But again, this is something that just explains kind of the shift from the promises of Reconstruction to the demise of those promises of Reconstruction, and moving into this new emergence of white supremacy absent slavery, right? Anything else you would like to add there, Mr. Peterzak?
No, just adding some of the comments again that you've mentioned, and a definition of Jim Crow in the notes.
Okay. This sentence here too is an illuminating sentence that the text provides. Emancipation unsettled the Southern social order, right? And again, what that's referring to is, basically what that's referring to is that what white supremacy was predicated on was Black slavery. And so once Black slavery is legally demolished, this is going to have a, as they put it here, an unsettling effect, as it should, on white Southerners. But what Reconstruction didn't deal with effectively is the tenacity of white supremacy during this time. And just because slavery is gone, it's not going to undermine people, what's in the hearts and minds of people. And so what we see with Jim Crow laws, segregation laws, is okay, we can't have slaves, but we can make sure that these people understand where their proper place is, in quotes, proper place is within society, which is to be subjected to us as white people. Okay, excellent. So great stuff here. Let's move on to number 6. Who's got number 6? Present this one right here. How did the economic and social changes of the late 19th century and early 20th centuries challenge traditional gender norms? This is a real interesting one. So anyone from group 6, anyone out there to present this? All right. Well, I'll go through this unless somebody's turning on their mic right now. But basically what we have here, women working in factories, urban spaces, shifting cultures, social values, introduce brand new opportunities to challenge regular and sexual norms. Question here is why? We'll get to that in a second. Women became activists. For example, they targeted municipal reforms, launched labor rights campaigns, and above all, bolstered the suffrage movement. Ida B. Wells was an African-American woman born on the last years of slavery and was an anti-slavery lynching advocate. Excellent. Let's see here the theme, Kate Awakening. Okay, we got. Okay. This is an interesting phenomena that begins to kind of, you know, a lot of the things that we think that are inherent to being, you know, a man or a woman at any given time have very little to do with what's inherent to that, right? Oh, you know, there's obviously a biological element to being man or being a woman, but often what's ignored is a lot of factors that are out of our control of how that is shaped, right? So let's do that. I'm trying to bring up a chapter. It's being blocked. There we go. Oh, here we go. There we go. Jeez. Okay. Sorry about that. Wanted to bring up this right here. The chapter does a really good job of explaining there we go. Wait. Cities. Oh, sorry. Jumped up on me without me knowing it. Okay, here we go. Okay, here, sorry about that. I was trying to locate it and it jumped on me. This right here, this statement right here does need a little explanation, but it's an important thing to keep in mind. The anonymity of urban spaces, right, presented an opportunity in particular for female sexuality and for male and female sexual experience along a spectrum of orientations and gender identities, right? This, right, I wish the chapter actually kind of further explained this. I can't emphasize enough this phenomena of where it's something that we kind of find normal, like if you live or visit a big city, or even living in a minor city like McAllen, you will experience a degree of anonymity that is contrast from the way life used to be for millennia for the human experience, which was if you were born prior to the Industrial Revolution, people would not really venture 20 miles from the spot that they were born, right? And so you would know everybody in your community, and they would know you. And so this definitely within that environment, that would definitely have an impact on human sexuality, right? A lot of sexual behavior to some extent would be kept in check in accordance to whatever that community valued sexual activity or behavior, right? In a state of being anonymous where nobody knows you, you can reinvent yourself and create your own norms, right? And so, you know, we're emphasizing here, the chapter's emphasizing here, sexual behavior and sexual gender identities that are beginning to develop here, but this is going to apply to all sorts of facets to human behavior, right? The idea of first impressions is going to develop as urbanization develops and industrialization develops. So prior to industrialization, being not venturing 20 miles from the spot you were born, everybody knew who you were. So if you were the town drunk, there was no hiding that. Or if you were the guy that was very successful, there was no hiding that. Everybody knew up front, so there was no reason to put up a front in that. But with anonymity and the phenomena of anonymity developing out of this process, first impressions become important. So this is going to have an effect on fashion, right? And so if you're going to an employer for a job in an interview, that person has no idea who you are. So you better, if you're seeking a job, better understand, well, how do you dress? How do you clad yourself? How do you present yourself? How do you behave in a certain way? And where are you going to learn that from? Well, you're going to learn that from the mass media that's developing and looking around and seeing what other people are doing in order to develop that first impression within this anonymous setting that the urban environment is providing. So anything wanted to add there, Mr. Peterzak?
No, a lot of great ideas. Again, you're talking, it's not mentioned, but Amelia Bloomer, Bloomer's clothing, women are increasing riding bicycles, which also gives them more freedoms. So it's just working outside of the home in factories. Now women are wage earners contributing financially to the families. It gives them a lot more power. So we haven't mentioned it, but in my class, I call that structural forces, and women are now displaying more agency against this masculine patriarchal society, although there is a lot of kickback as well. So it's an emerging struggle, and it's one that eventually leads to, the 19th Amendment by 1920.
Yeah, and the other thing that's not mentioned in this response is the effect urbanization had on men, right? And so let's see, where does it go into that? While many women liberated, and many sometimes simultaneously work to uplift others. Okay, many.
The bullet in the facts could be expanded and address that.
Okay, yeah, okay, muscular. Yeah.
Emasculating William Henry, William James, sorry.
Oh, Henry James, okay.
Yeah, no, his brother, William James.
Okay.
Talked about the Americanitis, the emasculation of Americans as well because of this. So there's a case counterpoint in that argument. Yeah,
and to put this in context, right, this generation of young men, their fathers were Civil War veterans, right? And so they are now, as they're growing up, right, the prospect for war, there really isn't any. So there's no place for a man to kind of demonstrate his manhood in war. And then the environment in which they are told that they need to succeed are urban environments where, you're not really using your body as a man. You're in an office, right? Doing data entry, right? And so you're not doing things that traditionally men would do to provide themselves and their family a living. And this was seen to have an effect on male masculinity, right? And so this is, we'll be visiting this again in the next unit with the Spanish-American War, but people like Theodore Roosevelt is going to make a great to-do with this and really push for war against Spain for that very reason. Like, oh, this is a good opportunity to give young men an opportunity to demonstrate their manliness out in the world. So let's move on to, last but not least, how did the South attempt to redefine the meaning of the Civil War after Reconstruction? Was it successful or was it not? So we have someone from number 7 to help present this.
South after Reconstruction era was resentful towards the emancipation of African Americans. The Civil War era destroyed the South's economy, but after the failure of Reconstruction, the South took back power over the states. They used their local and state power to reinforce the supremacy with Jim Crow laws. The South redefined the idea of giving equal rights to African Americans, and it was successful because of the 14th and 15th Amendment. The Reconstruction era had goals of giving former slaves rights, but it wasn't as successful because the South went back to their original ways. White supremacists were able to prevent African Americans from voting through fear tactics, and they murdered African Americans for unconfirmed rumors or them being too uppity. They also attempted to glorify the South by using the Civil War as a fight for home and honor, as opposed to being fought over slavery.
Nice, very well put. Right, and then we have some facts right here that you would want to, real good facts over here that you would want to incorporate in the response to kind of buttress what's being presented right here. Just to make sure everyone understands what this term means, uppity, right? Right, this would be an accusation towards any Black American at this time. It could just be somebody who was presenting themselves as successful, right? They're dressing in clothes that demonstrate their economic success, or if they're going to vote and then they, they're being precluded from voting. They kind of bring up the fact that, hey, I've got a 14th and 15th Amendment right to vote. Well, that's being uppity, and that could get somebody in serious trouble as the South is returning to white supremacist rule at this time.
Exactly, going against the kind of deference, now fighting against that deference where they're displaying their newly earned, newly gained political power.
Yeah. But yeah, this last sentence right here, well put. This is something that you want to keep in mind. They also attempted to glorify the South by excusing the Civil War as a fight for home and honor, as opposed to being fought over slavery. So if you look at, and this is the beginning, like this is something that for some reason remains controversial today. There are people out there that are adamant that the Civil War had a little bit to do with slavery, but not much, right? And really what was at play was, a valid attempt to push back against centralized power, right? So the federal government had become too powerful and the South was just attempting to push back against that. There is, and with any kind of propaganda, there is definitely an element of truth to that. But if anybody wanted to refute that notion that the South was trying to fight over home and honor and really had nothing to do with slavery, all one has to look at is the when the South seceded, all the states that seceded from the Union created their own Declaration of Independence. If you look at this Declaration of Independence, they are pretty clear on why they are seceding from the Union. And what they mention in there over and over is that we are worried that the federal government is going to destroy the institution of slavery, so we're out of here, right? And so it's sort of a half-truth that the South seceded from the Union because of the overarching power of the federal government. What's left out of that narrative that develops out of this idea of the New South, or the redefinition of the South post-Reconstruction, is the issue that they were worried about of the strong federal government was getting rid of slavery. Okay. Yeah, anything else you wanted to add to that, Mr. Peterzak?
Other than just choose a side, support that side that you select with facts. It's a persuasive response and you'll be fine.
Yeah, good stuff. Yeah, really good stuff, everybody. I would like to commend you, especially given the fact that we are having so many technical problems, but we are, in the end, we're able to come together and present some things here. So definitely use, again, as always, these responses as a catalyst to the notes that you've already taken. Do go back and really try to confirm this and try to further develop anything that you see when you have the time, when you're kind of sitting alone and having the time to do so for yourself. But you definitely have something to springboard off and developing your notes for the upcoming unit exam. Stop recording there.